This is a lecture on The Child by Munshi Premchand. On our previous class, we had done a brief introduction to who Munshi Premchand is. So when you do write your answer, remember that he is somebody that has greatly influenced the field of Indian literature, especially in Hindi and Urdu. He wrote in three languages, English, Hindi, and Urdu, and that is why he is known as Munshi, which is to say the teacher of languages. He again was known as the Upanyas Samrat, which is the emperor of novelists. So somebody who has contributed immensely to the field of prose in Indian writing. Again, he was deeply influenced by the works of Tagore and also Russian writers such as Gorkin and Leo Tolstoy. So you see how much of his writing style depends on social realism. So he believes that eventually the work that he produces should somehow reform the society, very similar to even Khalil Gibran, where they believe that their writing should be political, that at the end of the day, it should contribute to rectifying the evils and vices in society. Right, and we see that very beautifully reflected in this short story as well. So, The Child, written in the 1920s, the reason that you still study it and the reason that we still celebrate it is because the ideologies behind it, or the characterization of Gangu, is so very radical even for today's society. Right, we're in 21st century, but we still follow very strict codes of conduct. We still follow very rigid codes, patriarchal codes, that is. So we see how all of this was questioned and challenged in the 1920s. So you could just imagine how radical a story, how challenging, or how bashful to some extent it would have been at that point, right? So today it is still relevant because our Indian society, though we've progressed in many aspects, some aspects, especially moral values that we attach to women, have still remained in the dark ages. So because of that, the story is very pivotal in recognizing a very feminist voice in the 1920s. So yes, so we've established that there are very two prominent characters, and that is Gangu and the narrator. So the narrator, since this is in first person narrative, we understand that much of the story is from the perspective of the narrator. So we learn about Gangu, his ideologies, his behavior through the narrator. So to some extent, it can be a biased perspective as well, but we see how that is rectified or changed at the end of the story. So the narrator, we understand, is somebody who follows a certain code of conduct. He believes that this should also be followed by his servants. Right? He again is very egotistical, very arrogant, right? Especially from his behavior with the servants. He refuses to take part in their frivolous, trivial talks. He does not want to engage or encourage them to come forth seeking a leave or an increase in their salary. Right, so he's not somebody that sees the people that work for him as people that stand on par with him. Instead, he sees them as beneath him, as below him, both intellectually and socially. And that is why the story is so interesting, because at the end, it is a man that he deemed as, or he saw as less worthy, correct his ways. Right, and that is the irony behind the story. So that is the narrator so far as we know. He again is a very patriarchal man. We understand as the story progresses because of the kind of ideologies or the kind of ideas he has attached to Gomti Devi. But now, what do we know about Gangu? Now, Gangu is a very interesting character, very complex character, in fact. So he is a man of many contrasts. So one is that he's a Brahmin, but at the same time he's uneducated, right? So as a Brahmin man, there are very strict religious codes prescribed by his caste that he follows, right? And that is where he refuses to touch the tumbler that the narrator, who presumably would be of lower caste, as in below a Brahmin. He again does not have any friends, so as to suggest that again within a very casteist society, a Brahmin man is expected to only form relationships with people of their caste, and so his refusal to take part in any social gatherings is because of his adherence to his caste laws. He again is somebody that is very short-tempered, ill-tempered, probably because of how socially he is in fact superior to the rest of them, but because of his occupation, he ranks below the narrator and is equal to the various servants. So because of that, he could be frustrated, irritated by his positioning in society. But at the same time, while he does follow some very strict codes, religious codes, he is again not like every Brahmin, right? One is that he is an illiterate man. Now, ideally, a Brahmin man is privileged enough to gain knowledge. They are recognized through the fact that they are the ones who hold knowledge in society. So that is quite ironic that Gangu, being a Brahmin, is an illiterate man. Next, he again does not follow all the religious codes. For example, he does not take the religious bath. He again does not, conduct various pujas. So you see how he follows certain codes that he believes is right, but certain codes he overlooks them, right? So we've established these two characters so far. So one day we learn that Gangu has requested a resignation from his post. And of course, at first, the narrator is very irked by the fact that Gangu wants to carry out a conversation with him. But finally, he agrees to it, and he is quite shocked to learn that Gangu wants to leave. Again, to note that generally in a society such as this, it is usually not the servant that requests a leave, but rather it is the master or the boss that usually asks you to leave the job. So again, quite ironic that Gangu is the one who's quite autonomous, in fact, taking a step to say, I want to leave this job. But the reason behind his departure, or the reason behind his resignation, is what is very crucial to the story. So we learn that he has fallen in love with a woman named Gomti Devi, and he believes that because of his connection or his relationship with this woman, it would affect the reputation or status of the narrator. And why is that so? Because Gomti Devi is a very mysterious and a very interesting character, not just for 1920s India, but even 21st century India. So Gomti Devi is a widow. She's been married later on twice, and both the times she has left her husband. So totally she's been married 3 times, right? Now, Gomti Devi's identity is very important because 1920s India, she falls into two very problematic categories for a woman. Now, essentially, in a very patriarchal, sexist society like ours, a woman will fall into two categories. One would be the ideal woman; she would be the dutiful wife or the dutiful mother, or she is the fallen woman with loose character, right? So here, Gomti Devi falls, of course, into the latter, but again is in a very problematic position. One, her position as a widow. Now, a widow in 1920s India is often seen as the one that brings ill luck. She's the carrier of bad omen, and because of that, she's usually not invited to any auspicious weddings. She's again an asexual being, right? Again, right after her husband's death, or these were, codes and religions that rituals that were followed, where her hair would be shaved off. She'd be not asked to, she would be forced to wear white. No form of jewelry would adorn her, right? So all of that to defeminize her, to desexualize her. So she becomes an asexual being after marriage, right? But again, very interestingly, Gomti Devi is forced to marry twice, but both times she leaves the husband. Now, we don't know whether she left the husband or the husband left her. We don't know what the reason is. But of course, in most cases, especially in traditional India, usually the blame falls upon the woman, right? It doesn't matter whether your husband was unfaithful or he was abusive, but the fact that you chose to leave, the fault lies in you, right? So Gomti Devi, one identity as a widow, she is somebody that is a bad omen in society itself. But again, as a woman that has left her husband twice, two husbands, another identity that she has is of a woman with loose character, loose moral, right? And there are various other terms that the narrator himself calls in the short story, right? So again, a fallen woman, somebody who has low moral, somebody who's not the carrier of the virtues and the righteousness of what a woman ideally should be, right? So we see how her very character or her very identity is very challenging to the patriarchal norms. And so what is so very surprising and interesting is that a person like Gangu, who is so very orthodox and set in his ways, is in fact the one to fall in love with a woman like Gomti Devi, right? Usually, you would expect somebody who is, very, this is again a very problematic saying, but of course, generally the saying is that a person that has seen the world, read a lot of books, has met a lot of people, they are more likely to overlook differences and be accepting of change. But somebody who has never stepped out of his house, who was brought up in a very caste-based, sexist society, in fact, he is the one who challenges these notions and chooses to marry a woman like Omti Devi. So again, in the short story as well, if you remember, the narrator says this illiterate and orthodox Brahmin, untouched by new ideas, is going to marry this shameless whore. So you see, this is again very ironic that a man such as the narrator is the one to say this, right? Because the narrator, we can understand that since he again has so many servants, he's quite well established in society. Somebody, so from that we understand he's a well-read, learned, educated man, probably somebody who has met many people in his life, right? And so for a man like him to hold on to such strict codes, such patriarchal codes, is what is so ironic and very disappointing, in fact. And so to him, it is quite surprising that someone like Gangu, in fact, challenges these notions. Right? Again, the short story, if you see the fact that they give her so many terms, right? Whore, slut, they call her many things in the short story. So we also understand that in this paragraph, the officials of the ashram had married her off 3 times, and each time she had left her husband. So and then again, and now she lived in a small room in the mohalla and had become a source of fun for the mohalla's bad character. So you see, this exemplifies or this characterizes the